On the morning of February 19th, 1980, the music world was shaken by the sudden death of AC/DC frontman Bon Scott. He was just 33 years old, at the height of his powers, and had helped transform AC/DC from a hard-working Australian rock band into one of the most electrifying acts on the planet. His death was as shocking as it was mysterious. Even decades later, fans still ask the same haunting question. What really happened the night Bon Scott was found in that car? Bon Scott was known for living life at full throttle. His voice, his swagger, and his wild stage presence made him one of rock's most unforgettable frontmen. Off stage, he carried the same rebellious energy. He was charming, funny, and larger than life, but he also embraced the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle. Late nights, heavy drinking, and a relentless touring schedule had become routine. To many who knew him, Bon seemed indestructible. That illusion would be shattered in the early hours of a cold London morning that on February 18th, 1980, Bon spent the evening out in London with friends. One of those friends was Alistair Kinnear, an acquaintance who would later play a central role in the story of Bon's final hours. The two reportedly spent the night drinking heavily at a club called the Music Machine in Camden, a popular spot for musicians and nightlife regulars. By all accounts, Bon was in good spirits. There was no indication that this night would be any different from countless others. As the evening wore on, Bon became heavily intoxicated. Witnesses later described him as extremely drunk, to the point where he could barely function. Eventually, Kinnear offered to drive him home. But somewhere along the way, Bon either passed out or became completely unresponsive, rather than carrying him inside or seeking immediate medical help. Kinnear reportedly left Bon sleeping in the back seat of his Renault 5, parked outside his apartment in East Dulwich. It was a decision that would later spark endless debate. Why was Bon left alone in the car on such a cold night? Could more have been done? Was there a point when medical intervention might have saved him? These questions have lingered for more than 4 decades, fueling speculation and controversy. The next morning, Kinnear returned to the car and discovered that Bon was still there. But something was terribly wrong. Bon was unresponsive. He was rushed to King's College Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, often described medically as death by misadventure. He had apparently choked on his own vomit while unconscious. The image is tragic. One of rock's greatest voices, silence in the back seat of a small car, alone and unable to call for help. It remains one of the most heartbreaking endings in rock history. Yet almost immediately, questions arose about the circumstances surrounding Bon's death. Some found Kinnear's account difficult to accept. Why had he not taken Bon inside? Why leave him in a car overnight, especially in winter? Others wondered whether there were details that had never fully come to light. Rumors circulated that Bon may have been involved in other activities that night, while the official version of events omitted key details. However, despite the speculation, no credible evidence has ever emerged to contradict the coroner's findings. Bon Scott died from acute alcohol poisoning after a night of heavy drinking. The tragedy appears to have been the result of a perfect storm: excessive alcohol consumption, loss of consciousness, and the absence of timely medical assistance. For AC/DC, Bon's death was devastating. The band had built its identity around his raspy vocals, mischievous lyrics, and irreverent personality. He wasn't just a singer. He was the soul of the group. In the immediate aftermath, the remaining members considered disbanding altogether. It seemed impossible to continue without him. But after discussions with Bon's family, they decided that the best way to honor his memory was to carry on. Bon would have wanted the music to continue. That decision led to the recruitment of Brian Johnson, whose powerful voice brought a new energy to the band while respecting the foundation Bon had helped build. The result was Back in Black, released just 5 months after Bon's death. The album became not only a tribute to Bon Scott, but one of the best-selling albums in music history. Songs like Hell's Bells and Back in Black carried an emotional weight that resonated deeply with fans around the world. The record immortalized Bon's legacy while ushering AC/DC into a new era. Even so, Bon Scott's influence remains inseparable from the band's identity. His songwriting, his charisma, and his unmistakable voice helped define classic hard rock. Tracks like Highway to Hell, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, and Whole Lotta Rosie still stand as monuments to his talent. The circumstances of his death continue to fascinate because they represent both the allure and the danger of rock and roll excess. Bon lived exactly as he performed, boldly, recklessly, and without compromise. But that same fearless spirit came at a cost. In the years since, many have revisited the details of that final night, hoping to uncover hidden truths or untold secrets. Yet perhaps the real tragedy is simpler than any conspiracy. It was a terrible accident, born from a combination of intoxication, vulnerability, and one fateful decision. Bon Scott was not defeated by scandal or mystery. He was lost to the very lifestyle that had made him a rock legend. His death serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly excess can turn fatal, and still his legacy burns as brightly as ever. Every time an AC/DC song roars from a speaker, Bon's spirit is there, raw, rebellious, and unforgettable. He may have left the world far too soon, but his voice remains immortal. The night Bon Scott was found in that car was not just the end of a life. It was the end of an era. Yet from that tragedy emerged one of rock's most enduring legacies. His story continues to captivate because it is both inspiring and heartbreaking, a reminder of the brilliance he brought to music and the fragility of even the brightest stars. Bon Scott's final night will always carry an air of sadness and unanswered what-ifs. But what remains beyond all doubt is the impact he left behind. He helped shape rock history, and his influence still echoes through generations of musicians and fans. In the end, Bon Scott was exactly what rock and roll was meant to be. Loud, fearless, imperfect, and unforgettable. In the years since, countless stories have circulated about Bon Scott's final hours. Some are based on fact, while others have been shaped by rumor, speculation, and the mythology that often surrounds rock stars who die too young. What is known is that Bon spent the evening of February 18th, 1980, in London, enjoying a night out that seemed, at least on the surface, entirely ordinary for him. He had been socializing, drinking heavily, and spending time with acquaintances, embracing the kind of nightlife that had long been part of his rock and roll persona. That evening, Bon met up with a friend, Alistair Kinnear, a man who would later become central to the story of Bon's final hours. The two reportedly spent the night drinking at several clubs in London, including the well-known Music Machine in Camden. Witnesses later recall Bon being in high spirits. He was lively, talkative, and as usual, the center of attention. Nothing about his behavior suggested that the night would end in tragedy as the hours wore on. However, Bon became increasingly intoxicated. By the early morning, he was reportedly unable to stand or even speak coherently. Kinnear, faced with the task of getting his friend home safely, placed Bon in his Renault 5 and drove toward his own flat. According to Kinnear's later account, Bon had fallen into a deep sleep during the drive, unable to wake him upon arrival. Kinnear decided to leave him the car for the night, believing he would simply sleep it off. It was a decision that would later be scrutinized endlessly. Why didn't he call for medical help? Why not bring Bon inside? These questions have lingered for decades. At the time, though, heavy drinking was hardly unusual in the rock scene. To many, it probably seemed like Bon was simply passed out after another wild night. The next morning, Kinnear returned to the car, expecting to find Bon groggy but alive. Instead, he discovered that Bon was unresponsive. Panic set in immediately. Bon was rushed to King's College Hospital, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, often described medically as death by misadventure. In simple terms, Bon had consumed so much alcohol that his body could no longer cope. He had apparently vomited while unconscious and then asphyxiated. It was a tragic and horrifying end, one that has claimed many lives under similar circumstances. That longtime friend, Alistair Kinnear. The two had reportedly been out at a London club called the Music Machine, a popular venue known for its lively atmosphere and late-night crowds. Accounts suggest that Bon had consumed a significant amount of alcohol that evening. Friends later described him as being in high spirits, laughing, talking, and enjoying himself as he often did. There was no obvious sign that this night would be any different from the many others that had come before it. Bon was known for living life at full throttle, and nights of heavy drinking were hardly unusual in the world he inhabited. As the evening wore on, Bon became increasingly intoxicated. Eventually, Kinnear drove him away from the club in his Renault 5. According to Kinnear's later statements, Bond was in no condition to care for himself. When they arrived at Kinnear's home in East Dulwich, Bond was reportedly so deeply asleep or unconscious that Kinnear was unable to rouse him. Rather than continue trying, he made a decision that would later be scrutinized endlessly. He left Bond in the car to sleep off the effects of the night. At the time, such a choice may not have seemed extraordinary. It was a different era, one less attuned to the dangers of alcohol poisoning than today. To Kinnear, it may have appeared to be the safest and simplest option. Bond was breathing, apparently sleeping, and there was no immediate indication of a medical emergency. Yet that decision would become the focal point of decades of debate and heartbreak. The next morning, when Kinnear returned to check on his friend, he discovered that Bond was unresponsive. Panic quickly set in. Bond was rushed to King's College Hospital, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The official cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, with a certificate noting death by misadventure. Nights he had spent out on the town. Bond had built a reputation as a hard-living rocker, someone who embraced the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle with enthusiasm. Yet those close to him also knew him as warm, funny, and deeply dedicated to his music. As the evening came to an end, Bond was reportedly too intoxicated to make it home on his own. Alistair Kinnear offered to drive him back. However, when they arrived at Bond's apartment, Kinnear found that Bond was either unable or unwilling to get out of the car. Rather than force the issue, Kinnear made a fateful decision. He left Bond sleeping in the front seat of his Renault 5, believing he would be safe there for the night. It was cold, but this was not an unheard of choice in an era when attitudes toward alcohol, safety, and personal responsibility were very different from today. The next morning, Kinnear returned to check on his friend. What he found as devastating. Bon Scott was unresponsive. He was rushed to King's College Hospital in London, but it was too late. Doctors pronounced him dead. The official cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, often described in the coroner's report as death by misadventure. He had apparently choked on his own vomit while unconscious. That stark explanation has remained the accepted account for more than 4 decades. Yet, as with many celebrity deaths, estions and speculation have persisted. Some fans and writers have wondered whether the circumstances were fully understood at the time, or whether details were lost in confusion of that morning. Over the years, alternative theories have appeared in books, documentaries, and online discussions, ranging from claims of negligence to more elaborate conspiracies. However, none of these theories have been supported by credible evidence, and the official findings have never been overturned. What remains clear is that Bon Scott's death was a tragic combination of alcohol unconsciousness and delayed medical intervention. Whether he might have survived under different circumstances is a question that will never be answered. What is certain is that the loss was sudden, shocking, and deeply felt across the music world. For AC/DC, the aftermath was emotionally devastating. The band briefly considered disbanding, as Bon was not only their lead singer, but also a defining creative force. His lyrics, attitude, and vocal style had shaped their identity. After discussions with his family and close friends, the remaining members decided that Bond would have wanted them to continue. This decision eventually led to the recruitment of Brian Johnson and the creation of the landmark album Back in Black, which served both as a tribute and a rebirth. Today, Bon Scott is remembered as one of rock's most influential frontmen. His legacy lives on through the music he created, which continues to inspire new generations of musicians and fans. The story of his final night remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of life. Even for those who seem larger than life themselves, in the weeks and months following Bon Scott's death, official inquiries and media coverage focus heavily on reconstructing his final hours. The coroner's findings in London concluded that there was no evidence of foul play. The ruling of death by misadventure was based on toxicology results and witness statements, which pointed consistently to severe alcohol intoxication as the primary cause. Alistair Kinnear, who had been with Bond during the last hours of his life, found himself under intense public scrutiny. Questions were raised about his decision to leave Bond in the car overnight. Critics argued that he should have sought medical help immediately, while others suggested that, given the norms of the time and the appearance of Bond simply being asleep, the decision may have seemed less alarming in the moment than it appears in hindsight. Kinnear maintained that he believed Bon was simply sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. He later stated that there was no indication Bon was in immediate danger when he left him. Despite this, public opinion remained divided, and his name became permanently associated with one of rock's most tragic deaths as rumors spread. The story of Bon Scott's final night began to take on a mythic quality. Some accounts exaggerated the level of mystery, while others speculated about unknown substances or hidden circumstances. Over time, these narratives grew in popularity, especially among fans seeking deeper meaning or unanswered questions. However, repeated investigations and biographical research have consistently returned to the same conclusion. Bon Scott died as a result of acute alcohol poisoning after a night of heavy drinking. London in 1980 was a city where rock and roll excess was part of the cultural fabric. Musicians frequently lived fast-paced, high-risk lifestyles, and the dangers of alcohol abuse were often underestimated. In that context, Bon's behavior was not unusual, even if the outcome was tragically extreme. For those closest to him, the loss was personal and profound. Members of AC/DC described feeling numb and devastated in the days following his death. Bon had been more than just a bandmate. He was a friend, a creative partner, and a driving